Whenever Magnus Carlsen and Hans Niemann are playing against each other, there's always something dramatic happening. Good news for you, another very exciting game has just been played between the two on chess.com. It's titled Tuesday, the time control is 3 minutes plus 1 second increment, which will explain the number of mistakes we get to see, but you will enjoy it. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and I will dive straight into the action. Magnus Carlsen is playing with the white pieces, goes for the move 1 e4. And we remember on previous occasions, Hans also played the Berlin defense after the move e5. Magnus even made a statement once just by going for a very well-known draw that basically he was saying that he doesn't want to play against Hans. But now Hans is not going for the Berlin defense, but he plays the sharpest opening out there, the Sicilian, and he goes for the Najdorf variation. So we have the open Sicilian, and after knight c3, it's a6, it's the Najdorf, bishop e3, e5, and now, okay, the sharpest move here is knight b3, which usually leads to positions with opposite castled kings, but Magnus goes for a more solid approach with the move knight f3, but we get a game. Bishop e7. White develops the bishop to c4, both sides are castling kingside, and here Black develops the bishop to e6, attacking the bishop on c4. And what is White gonna do with that bishop? Well, in a lot of cases the bishop just goes back to b3. White doesn't want to trade off himself the bishop, but here Magnus goes for the other line. He actually takes the bishop on e6. Now after f takes e6, you can say that Black does have control over the d5 square. So the knight, the white knight, is not able to go there, but White has a different plan. White goes here for the move knight a4. And the idea is to come in with the knight to b6 to attack the rook on a8, and the knight on b6 will be supported by the bishop on e3. Now Black played here the move knight fd7, controlling that square. Because actually if you use the other knight, knight bd7, then White's idea here is to play the move knight to g5. This is the main idea behind White's play. You're attacking the pawn on e6 and there's no convenient defense against this idea. So therefore knight fd7 is played, and now White continues with the move c4, trying to get a grip on the center with two nice pawns on c4 and e4. Black develops the knight to c6, White goes rook c1, and this position still has been reached in a number of games, and I think Black is doing quite okay here. But here Hans goes for the move b6. This is a sort of a novelty, has almost never been played before, and White immediately plays here the move queen to b3. So now the queen, bishop and knight are all attacking the pawn on b6. So Black defends it with the move rook b8, but now we see White's idea. It's to play the move c5, opening up the diagonal for the queen to win the pawn on e6. Okay, Black of course captures the pawn on c5, knight takes c5, b takes c5, queen takes e6 with check. The king goes into the corner, materials even again. And Black is now intending to take the pawn on b2, and therefore White simply played here the move b3. So how should we evaluate this position? From a positional point of view, it looks like White's pieces are better. Why? Okay, bishop is okay, the white squares, they are pretty vulnerable. But on the other hand, Black has the possibility also here to play the move knight d4. So you're attacking the knight, you're attacking the queen. White decides here to trade off the bishop for the knight, and okay, Black has to decide how to take back. You don't want to take back with the c-pawn actually, because then the rook will come to c6, White will double the rooks, and this pawn is not so dangerous. White's major pieces, they are dominating the center of the board. So instead Hans decides here to recapture on d4 with its e-pawn, but now White decides to strike in the center with the move e5. Very interesting idea, with the point that if you do take on e5, it's knight takes e5, threatening to win an exchange with a move like knight f7, or even to play here this move, knight to d7, which is also a knight fork. So, of course, Black is not going to take that pawn on e5, but Hans played here the move d5, which is a good move, excellent idea in fact. And even it's a pawn sacrifice, because the pawn on a6 can just be taken here. But Magnus didn't play it, I'm not sure why. Probably he didn't like that these pawns are potentially quite good, and well, I think if Black gets the chance here to go for queen c8, his position is not too bad at all, because white will not be able to march forward that easily with its passed pawn. So Magnus instead played here the move queen g4. I'm not sure this is the best way of playing, but Magnus decides to keep the queen on the board. Rook b4. So here we see the rook is eyeing the queen on g4, and Magnus played the move rook fd1. And this is already a very complicated position. I mean, a lot of pieces still on the board. It's quite an unbalanced position. Bishop versus knight, imbalance in pawn structure as well. And black made here a very inaccurate decision by playing the move queen e8. I will get there in a second. But for instance, a move like d3 is actually very strong. Hans didn't play it probably believing that the pawn on d3 is vulnerable, but the queen is under threat. But now, after queen e6, there's rook b6. You're attacking the queen there. And if the queen goes to g4, you go with the rook to g6. And there's not much white can do, because if the queen goes to the other side, if it doesn't want to get followed by any of the black rooks, there's rook takes f3. Black is winning the piece. While in case you go queen h3, black can just repeat the moves here. With rook h6, queen goes to the g file, and then rook g6 again. There's no progress whatsoever. So that was already a possibility more or less to make a draw by force. Was not seen. Or Hans was just playing for more than a draw. That's also possible. Queen e8 played in the game. But now the queen actually can come into e6. And here we see the big difference. The queen hits the pawn on d5. And the pawn is no longer defended. While also the rook is not able to get back to b6 anytime soon. Here queen f7 played. Still the pawn on a6 can be taken. But Magnus is not interested in that pawn. He just wants clarity. He goes for the exchange of queens. Queen takes f7, rook takes f7, knight e1. Nice rerouting of the knight to the blockading square. And okay, still very complicated position. If the knight comes to d3, the pawns are nicely blockaded. Also the pawn on c5 and the rook on b4 are under threat. Okay, probably rook b6 is a good idea. If the knight goes to d3, you can protect it. And things are looking pretty okay here. I mean, the idea to go knight b4, making use of this pin along the c file, knight cannot be taken, then the rook goes to e6, and knight is hanging. If you take on d5, rook takes e5, black is absolutely okay. Was not played. Instead, g5 is played by Hans Niemann, but now the knight comes to d3, hitting the rook. Rook goes to b5 to keep the pawn defended, and Magnus says, okay, I give some space to my king. Never any back rank issues. Black brings the king to the center. And okay, white can also play in a similar way. Maybe at the right moment try to get in f4 to connect the pawns. But here Magnus rushed here with the move e6. Hits the rook on f7. Rook f8. And now a4. Attacking the rook on b5. Rook takes b3. Black is capturing the pawn. And here white's idea becomes clear. There's knight takes c5. Attacking the rook on b3. Attacking the pawn on a6. But excellent move by Hans Niemann. Rook c3. He's controlling now this c file. The rook is safe. White never really wants to take on c3, as that would undouble the pawn on the d file. Also the knight on c5 is now hanging. White decided here to take the pawn on a6, and this is not without any risk, because the knight is kind of stranded at the side of the board. And well, Hans played rook fc8, but in fact it's more precise here to first attack the knight on a6 with rook a8, because after knight c7, then you put a rook on c8, and you see the knight is under threat. If the knight takes the pawn, the rook on c1 can be taken, and black wins the rook. So in that case, the only move for white is to take on c3. Black takes back with the pawn, and this is a very dangerous position, because I think the c pawn is really strong. If you do take on d5, huge blunder, there's c2, attacking the rook. If you block it, there's bishop a3. Black is even winning here. I mean, white can still defend better, for instance, with a move like knight b5, so that you're controlling also the a3 square. The bishop is not able to join the attack immediately, but I would not feel comfortable here playing from the white side. But in any case, this was not played. Hans instead played rook fc8 immediately, hoping that white is going to take. But now, since the knight is not under threat, white can just move the rook away to the b file. d3 played, king goes to g2, and now the rook comes in, hits the pawn on a5, on a4. White therefore played the move a5, and now it's very complicated. I think black is absolutely okay if you play something like king f6. But here Hans wants to eliminate that a pawn immediately. But there's rook to b7, pinning the bishop on e7, king f6, and now the knight comes back into play with the support of the rook on b7. Now the big threat here is to take on d5 with check, hitting the king and the bishop. For instance, if you take on a5, defending the pawn on d5, there's just rook takes d3, and all the danger is gone. Pawn on d5 will be lost probably very soon. Or even white can consider moves like rook f3, rook f7. White is playing for the initiative here. So instead of taking on a5, bishop c5 is played. And this is a big moment in the game. Remember that the clock is also ticking. Yeah, I mean, players are under a minute here already. And white has a big opportunity here now to win the game with the move e7. Remarkable shot which was missed by both players. The idea is that the pawn is just threatening to get promoted, but okay, that pawn is covered by both the king and the bishop, so both had to see in advance that bishop takes e7, runs into knight takes d5, winning the bishop on e7. While if you would instead take with the king on e7, then it's knight to b5 with a discovered check. You're picking up the rook. Let's say king f6, knight a3, bishop takes, rook takes d3. White is completely winning here. Was not played. Rook e1. Also a very logical move as you're trying to support your e-pawn. But there's d2. Now black is hitting the rook on e1. Knight takes d5 with check. Okay, the good news is that the pawn is defended by the rook, so the king gotta go away. But the rook has to go back to d1. Rook d3, attacking the knight, supporting the pawn. And if you do give black a bit of time, there is probably rook c1, and very likely that d pawn is going to be promoted very soon. But e7 played, white is fast, threatening e8 queen. Therefore rook e4 behind the passed pawn is the best place. And here Magnus made a huge blunder by playing here the move rook to b8. He is preparing just to promote the e-pawn, overlooking that black can just capture on e7. Knight takes e7, rook takes e7, and we get a rook endgame. We will get there in a second, but wait a moment. What can white do instead? Well, the key move is just to support that knight on d5 with the move rook to d7. That is the key move, setting up potential discovered checks with the knight coming to e3, checking the king, hitting the rook, and nothing is going to work. You cannot take the pawn on e7. There's just knight takes e7, and the rook still defends that knight on the 7th rank. Also bringing the king closer to attack the rook, runs into e8 queen, new queen. And also rook e1. It's not really going to work out here because of knight e3 check. And here the rook on d3 can be taken. Next the e-pawn will be deciding the game. Huge, big miss by white. Rook b8 played, as I said. Now we get this rook endgame. The d-pawn is dangerous. Even rook e1 is a potential threat. So the rook goes to b2. White wants to wrap up that pawn on d2. Rook a7. Black goes after the pawn on the a file. Pawns are getting exchanged. And here we have a rook endgame with only pawns on one wing. 3 versus 2. And normally this is just a dead roll. I mean, everybody. I mean, give me this against Garry Kasparov. Give me this against Magnus Carlsen. A classical game, no time pressure. I'm gonna save it. I'm pretty sure about it. But here, the time situation is that Magnus had 11 seconds on the clock. Hans, 5 seconds. Okay, 1 second increment, but basically it means no time to think. Just make the moves. Let's see what happens. Rook d7, h5. Making sure that the pawns are absolutely safe and white is not able to make any progress. So the pawn on h5 is well defended here. Rook f6, trying to cut off the king, but the king goes back. Everything is perfectly protected. White is going around with the rook, trying a lot, but not making any progress. Now the king is back, guarding the h-pawn, rook a3. And now white needs to try to find a plan to activate the king. So together with the rook, white is trying to get the king and rook to better places. But now the rook goes to the f-file. So the pawn on f2 is kept in charge. Rook e4, rook f3 check, king e2, rook goes back, rook f4. Okay, king and pawn endgames is something you rather avoid. So white has to deal with rook to e5, king d3, rook a5, king e4, king g6, rook f8, rook a4. You can just keep checks from the side. Why not? Forcing the king to go back in its cage. King h6. Everything is defended. White is not making progress here at all. So just now, white goes for the move f4. And black has a choice. You can do basically anything apart from blundering your rook. But capturing en passant is absolutely fine here as well. King takes f3, rook a4. Now it's 2 versus 1. And still, it should be a very easy draw as long as you keep your pawn on h5 well defended. And that's what Hans is doing for a long period of time. White is not making progress, but okay, enough reason to play on, especially if you keep the history between the two players in mind. Magnus definitely doesn't want to make a draw against Hans. And well, if you go here for something like king g5, you can give a check on g4. You can also go back to b5, so no progress there at all. The rook goes back to the 5th rank. King f3, and now, with seconds on the clock only, Hans, what are you doing? He just played here the move king f6, attacking the rook, totally forgetting that the pawn on h5 can be taken. Now it's 2 versus 0, and this is a very easy win. Black, of course, should instead have played the move king g6, defending the pawn, and white will have to accept that it's going to be a draw. Now, after winning the second pawn, well, the game is easily won. I mean, Magnus is not in a rush. He just improves its position. And step by step, he is marching forward with the pawns, with the king, ensuring that there are no checks from the side. That's the right way of playing. Now the rook goes to e4, rook b5, rook here to e7. That is a good move. King g8. And now h6. King h8, g5, very nice technique, of course. This is peanuts for Magnus, no problem at all. Rook b6, and now after the move king h5, Hans resigned. I mean, it's always going to be mate, or one of the two pawns is going to be promoted. You always got to watch out for stalemate tricks still, but that's not going to happen here. Black resigned, as I said. For instance, if you go for rook a6, well, it's rook e8 check. That's just a nice idea worth remembering. After king h7, now you bring up the g-pawn with check. The king can't go anywhere. If you take the pawn, it's rook e7, deflecting the king from the protection of the rook. You take the rook, and on the next move, it's going to be checkmate. What an incredible game between the two rivals. And Hans will not sleep well after this very painful loss. Let me know in the comments what you think of this game. Do you think Magnus deserved to win? Do you think Hans played really bad in the endgame, or maybe just a mouse slip even? Yeah, that's also possible. Let me know, and make sure to subscribe to the channel if you like these videos and you want to see more.